I was staring at a faded photograph of my 5-year-old son Jamal, who was kidnapped 30 years ago. The stranger sitting across the cafe booth slid a thick folder toward me and whispered that the whole truth about the kidnapping was inside. I slammed my hand on the table, demanding to know who the hell he thought he was. The young man slowly took off his sunglasses, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Because I am the boy in that picture." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your entire reality shattered in a single second. My name is Sterling. I am 75 years old, and for the last 3 decades I have been a man running on nothing but grief and caffeine. I built a multi-billion-dollar logistics empire right here in Atlanta from absolute scratch. I own shipping fleets and warehouses from Georgia to Chicago. I have thousands of people on my payroll who jump the second I raise my voice. But all that money, all that power, and all those properties never brought back the only 2 things I truly cared about in this world: my late wife, Valerie, and our little boy, Jamal. I was sitting in my usual back booth at a quiet diner on Peachtree Street. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had my daily ritual: a cup of black coffee and Jamal's old photograph placed gently on the table. It was a daily reminder of why I forced myself to get out of bed every morning. I did not even notice the young man until he slid into the booth right across from me. He did not ask for permission. He just sat down. He wore a sharp-tailored gray suit, looking like he belonged in a high-rise corporate boardroom rather than a run-down local diner. I am a wealthy man, and I am used to being approached by people begging for money. Over the years, countless con artists have tried to claim the massive cash reward I offered for information about Jamal. So I immediately tightened my jaw and told him he had exactly 10 seconds to get out of my booth before my private security detail waiting outside dragged him onto the pavement. He did not flinch. He did not even look at the door. He just stared at the photograph resting by my coffee cup. "Are you still searching for him?" he asked. His voice was steady and oddly calm, yet it carried a heavy weight that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. I felt a sudden violent surge of anger. "Do not play games with me, son," I warned him. My voice dropped to that low, gravelly tone that usually made my board of directors sweat in their expensive suits. "I do not know what kind of sick scam you are running today, but you picked the wrong old man to mess with." He ignored my threat completely. Instead, he reached inside his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He placed it right next to Jamal's photo. "The whole truth about the kidnapping is inside," he whispered. The air in the diner suddenly felt incredibly thin. I could not breathe properly. I looked at the heavy folder and then back at him. My heart, which had been beating to a slow, tired rhythm for 30 years, started to hammer violently against my ribs. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table so hard my dark knuckles turned gray. "Who the hell are you?" I asked, "and how do you know anything about my son?" He reached up and slowly removed his dark sunglasses. He looked me dead in the eye, and the entire universe just stopped. It was like looking into a magical mirror that reached back through time. He had Valerie's soft brown eyes. He had my strong, stubborn jawline. He had the exact same intense, intimidating stare that I used to see in my own reflection when I was 35 years old, building my company from the ground up. "Because I am the boy in that picture," he said. The clinking of coffee cups around us, the murmur of the waitresses, the loud traffic outside on the Atlanta streets, it all completely muted into pure dead silence. For 30 years I had imagined this exact moment. I had dreamed of tearful reunions, of falling to my knees, weeping, of wrapping my arms around my boy, and begging for his forgiveness for not keeping him safe on that terrible day. But reality is never like the dramatic movies you see on television. There were no tears right then. There were no hugs. There was only a suffocating, terrifying wave of shock. I stared at him, my mind desperately trying to connect the innocent face of the 5-year-old boy in the faded picture to the grown, hardened man sitting across from me now. "You are lying," I choked out. I wanted to believe it. Lord knows my soul desperately wanted to believe it. But my heart had been broken too many times before. I had paid millions of dollars to private investigators. I had chased down hundreds of false leads across the country. I had listened to countless young men claim they were my missing son just to get a payout. I could not let myself fall into another cruel trap. He did not argue with me. He did not try to convince me with emotional pleas or fake crying. He just opened the folder and took out a single sheet of paper with an official hospital laboratory logo stamped on the top. He pushed it across the table toward me. "I do not expect you to just take my word for it, Sterling," he said, using my first name instead of calling me Dad. "But you cannot argue with science." I picked up the piece of paper. My hands, which had built a logistics empire and never shook during multi-million-dollar negotiations, were trembling violently, like autumn leaves in the wind. It was a DNA test result from a certified national registry. I scanned the lines of complicated medical jargon until my eyes locked onto the final bolded conclusion at the very bottom. Probability of paternity is 99.9%. The blood sample I had submitted to the National Missing Persons Database a decade ago had finally found a match. He was Jamal. He was my flesh and blood. He was my son. I looked up at him, and my vision finally blurred with the hot tears I had held back for 3 decades. Jamal. I whispered, my voice completely breaking under the weight of a lifetime of sorrow. My son, you are alive. I reached across the table, wanting to grab his hands. I wanted to feel his skin to make sure he was real and not some cruel fantasy born from my grieving mind. But he pulled his hands back slightly. His expression remained incredibly guarded. It was clinical and cold. "My name is David." "Now," he said softly but with a firmness that commanded immediate respect. "And we do not have time for an emotional reunion right now. You are in immediate danger." I froze, my hands hovering uselessly over the table. "Danger," I repeated. "What are you talking about? I just found you. I have millions of dollars. I have the best security money can buy. Nobody can touch us now. I can protect you." David shook his head and his eyes darkened with a serious intensity that chilled me all the way down to the bone. "You do not understand," he said, leaning closer so no one else in the diner could hear him. "The people who took me, the people who have been lying to your face your entire life, they are not strangers from the street." He stood up from the booth, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. He looked down at me, and the words that came out of his mouth next hit me harder than a physical punch to the gut. "Do not go home, Sterling. Do not trust your daughter, Maya. And definitely do not trust her husband, Trent." "What?" I stammered, completely thrown off balance by the accusation. "Maya. Maya is your older sister. Trent is my son-in-law. They have been helping me search for you for years. They are my family." David let out a bitter, humorless laugh that sounded like scraping metal. "They are the exact reason I never came back home," he said coldly. "Read the file. Read every single page in that folder. Look at the bank statements. Listen to the audio drive hidden in the back pocket. Once you see the ugly truth, you will finally realize that the family you think you have been protecting has just been waiting for you to die." I sat there entirely paralyzed. My old mind refused to process the horrible accusation. Maya, my little girl. The one I had showered with unconditional love and money after her mother died. Trent, the white son-in-law. I had welcomed into my home with open arms, the man who always swore he would protect my business legacy. It was completely impossible. But David was not asking for my belief. "Read the file," he repeated firmly. "Then call the private number written on the front of the folder. We have a lot of work to do." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the diner, blending instantly into the busy Atlanta streets. I was left completely alone in the silent booth. The faded photograph of 5-year-old Jamal was still sitting next to my cold coffee cup, but right next to it was the thick folder that David had left behind. The folder that he promised contained the entire ugly truth. I stared at the manila envelope as if it were a ticking bomb waiting to explode. In a matter of 5 brief minutes, my entire universe had been turned upside down. My lost son was alive. He had been out there this whole time growing into a strong man without me. But the pure, overwhelming joy of that miracle was entirely eclipsed by the suffocating, terrifying dread of his warning. I slid my trembling hand over the rough texture of the folder. I thought about Trent, his overly eager smiles, the way he always insisted on managing the private company accounts to take the stress off my old shoulders. I thought about Maya, her constant repetitive suggestions that I needed to rest, that my lifelong obsession with finding Jamal was ruining my failing health. Were they really just concerned for a grieving old man? Or was there something much darker and more sinister hiding beneath their fake sympathy? The air in the diner felt incredibly heavy, pressing down hard on my chest. I knew that opening this folder would be the absolute point of no return. Once I read the contents inside, the life I knew would be over forever. The family I thought I had would be dead to me. But I am a man who built his life on facing hard, painful truths, no matter how much they hurt. I grabbed the folder, shoved it deep into my coat, and threw a $100 bill on the table. I walked out of the diner with a new and terrifying clarity. My son was alive, and if what he said was true, my worst enemies were sitting right inside my own living room. I drove back to my estate in Buckhead like a man possessed. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel of my car so tightly my knuckles ached. Inside my coat pocket, the thick manila folder rested against my chest like a ticking time bomb. My son was alive. Jamal was alive. The words echoed in my mind, playing over and over in a loop of pure disbelief and overwhelming relief. But riding right alongside that joy was a dark, suffocating shadow. David had warned me not to go home. He told me not to trust my own flesh and blood. He told me not to trust the man who slept under the same roof as my daughter. I wanted him to be wrong. God knows I wanted my son to be wrong about his sister. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of my property and parked. The massive stone house stood tall and silent. I walked up the marble steps and pushed the heavy oak doors open. I expected the usual quiet afternoon. Instead, I was hit with an atmosphere so tense and cold it felt like walking into a freezer. There was no warm greeting. There was no asking how my day went. Sitting on my custom leather sofa in the center of the living room were 3 people. My daughter Maya, looking immaculate and entirely unbothered. Her husband Trent wearing a smug expression that I suddenly wanted to wipe right off his face. And a man I did not recognize wearing a cheap gray suit holding a leather briefcase. A corporate lawyer. I could smell the legal parasites a mile away. I stood in the doorway looking at the 3 of them. I did not take off my coat. The heavy folder remained hidden against my ribs. "What is going on here?" I asked. My voice was low and perfectly steady, but the air in the room instantly grew heavy. Trent did not even have the basic decency to stand up. He leaned forward and tossed a thick stack of stapled papers onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud that echoed in the quiet room. "Sign it, Dad," he said. His voice lacked any trace of respect. It was the voice of a man who thought he had already won. I walked slowly toward the table. I did not reach for the paper. I looked down at the bold black letters printed across the top page. Declaration of Death in Absentia. My blood ran completely cold. I felt a violent surge of anger rising in my throat, but I forced myself to keep my face completely blank. "What is this, Trent?" I asked. "It is exactly what it looks like." Dad Maya finally spoke up. She did not meet my eyes. She kept her gaze fixed on the designer rug beneath her feet. "It has been 30 years. 30 years since Jamal disappeared. You have to face reality. He is never coming back. We need you to sign that paper today so we can legally declare him deceased." I looked at my daughter, the little girl I had raised alone after my wife Valerie passed away, the girl I had given everything to. I bought her the mansion she lives in. I paid for her elite education. I funded her extravagant lifestyle. And here she was sitting comfortably on my couch asking me to legally kill off her own baby brother. Trent stood up and crossed his arms, trying to look intimidating. He was a tall man, but he had never worked a day of hard labor in his life. "Let us be brutally honest here, Sterling," he said, dropping the word dad entirely. "That $20 million trust fund you set up for Jamal cannot stay frozen forever. The company is expanding, and we have massive quarterly deficits. We need liquidity right now. That money is just sitting there, rotting in a bank account for a ghost. If you sign this paper, the funds revert back to the primary estate. We can inject that capital straight into the logistics firm by Monday morning." I stared at him. The sheer audacity of this man standing in my house telling me what to do with my money. "I built Washington Logistics from the absolute ground up, Trent," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "After Valerie died, I worked 20-hour days. I loaded the delivery trucks myself. I swept the warehouse floors myself. I built this empire with my own two bare hands for one specific reason: to fund the search for my missing son. Every dollar this company makes belongs to my family. It does not belong to you." Trent let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Your family," he repeated, shaking his head. "I am the chief operating officer of your company. I am the one managing the daily headaches while you sit in diners staring at an old photograph. You are living in a fantasy world, Sterling, and quite frankly, it is starting to become a massive liability for all of us." I stepped closer to him. The heat of my anger was radiating off my skin.
"Are you calling me a liability in my own house?"
Trent did not back down. He actually smiled, a cold, predatory smile that made my stomach turn. "Yes, I am," he said smoothly. "You are 75 years old. You are tired. You are constantly forgetting things. You are obsessed with a dead child. The board of directors is already whispering about your declining mental state. You are not fit to run a multi-billion-dollar empire anymore." I turned to the lawyer sitting silently on the couch. "And who is this?" I demanded. "This is Mr. Vance," Trent said, gesturing to the man in the cheap suit. "He is an attorney specializing in elder law and estate management. He is here to make sure this transition happens smoothly. And if it does not happen smoothly, well, Maya and I have already taken precautions." I narrowed my eyes. Precautions? What kind of precautions? Trent picked up another folder from the table and held it up. "Medical guardianship papers," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Signed by a doctor who agrees summons that your obsessive grief and advanced age have rendered you mentally incompetent to manage your own financial affairs. If you do not sign Jamal's death certificate right here and right now, we will file these guardianship papers with the court tomorrow morning. I will be granted full legal control of Washington Logistics and your personal estate." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. "And you will be checking into the Oakwood Assisted Living Facility by dinner time. They have a lovely, secure ward for seniors who suffer from severe delusions." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. They had planned this perfectly. While I was out breaking my heart trying to find my son, my own daughter and her husband were plotting to lock me up in a mental asylum and steal the empire I built. They had doctors ready. They had lawyers ready. They were going to strip me of my freedom, my money, and my dignity. I slowly turned to look at Maya, the child I had sworn to protect, the child I had loved with every ounce of my soul. "Maya," I said, my voice trembling just a little, not from fear, but from a heartbreak so deep it felt like my chest was splitting open. "Are you really going to let him do this? Are you really going to declare your brother dead and lock your own father in a nursing home just to get your hands on my money?" I waited for her to crack. I waited for the little girl inside her to cry out and apologize. I waited for her to tell Trent to stop this madness. But Maya just sighed loudly. She stood up, smoothing out the wrinkles in her expensive silk skirt. She crossed her arms defensively and finally looked me directly in the eyes. Her gaze was completely empty. There was no love left in her, only pure, unfiltered greed. "Just sign it, Dad," she said coldly. "It is time to let it go. Stop making this so hard on us. You have held this family back for 30 years with your obsession. Sign the paper and you can stay in this house. Fight us and Trent will make sure you never step foot in the company headquarters again. It is your choice." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at the two of them, Trent with his smug, arrogant smirk, Maya with her cold, calculating eyes. In that exact moment, the last remaining shred of love I had for my daughter died completely. It withered away into dust. David was absolutely right. The man in the cafe had warned me, "Do not go home. Do not trust them. They have been waiting for you to die." My hand moved instinctively to my chest, pressing against the heavy manila folder hidden inside my coat. The folder that contained the DNA test. The folder that contained the absolute proof that Jamal was alive. I could have pulled it out right then and there. I could have thrown the DNA results in their faces and watched their greedy little plan crumble into ashes. I could have screamed that my son was coming back to take his rightful place. But I am a man who plays chess, not checkers. If I revealed my hand now, Trent would just find another way to destroy me. He would speed up the medical guardianship. He would freeze my accounts before I could stop him. I needed time. I needed to see exactly how deep this betrayal went. I needed to read every single page of the file my son had given me. I took a deep, slow breath. I forced my shoulders to slump forward. I let my hands tremble visibly, playing the exact role they expected me to play. The role of a defeated, broken old man. I looked down at the declaration of death on the glass table. Then I looked back at Trent. "You win," I whispered, making my voice sound incredibly weak and tired. "I do not have the strength to fight you anymore." Trent smiled victoriously, exchanging a quick, triumphant look with Maya. "Excellent," he said, pushing a silver pen across the table. "Sign right at the bottom." "No," I said, holding up a shaking hand. "I will sign it. I will give you the company. I will give you the trust fund, but I cannot do it today." Trent frowned, his patience instantly vanishing. "Why not? The lawyer is right here." I looked at Maya, forcing a single tear to pool in the corner of my eye. "Because I am asking for 3 days," I said, my voice cracking perfectly. "Give me 3 days to accept that my little boy is truly gone. Give me 3 days to say goodbye to the past. On Friday, bring the board of directors to the house. Bring the media. I will sign the death certificate publicly. I will hand over the keys to the empire in front of everyone, so there is no question about the legality of the transfer." Maya softened just a fraction, blinded by the promise of a public coronation. "That makes sense, Trent," she murmured. "A public signing stops the board from questioning the transition. It secures your position as CEO without a messy court battle." Trent thought about it for a few seconds. His greed outweighed his caution. He loved the idea of an audience. He loved the idea of standing in front of the cameras, accepting the keys to my billion-dollar kingdom. "Fine," Trent said, snatching the paper off the table. "You have 3 days, old man. Friday night, we host a gala right here in your ballroom. You sign the paper, you announce my promotion, and you finally retire. Do not try any tricks. My lawyer will be watching your every move." He grabbed his coat and walked toward the front door. Maya followed him without even saying goodbye. They walked out of my house, leaving me standing alone in the center of the living room. I listened to the heavy oak doors click shut. The second they were gone, the fake tremble in my hands stopped completely. My slumped shoulders straightened up. I stood tall, my jaw set like solid granite. I reached into my coat and pulled out the heavy folder David had given me. I looked at the front cover. My heart was no longer breaking. It was turning into absolute ice. They wanted to lock me in an asylum. They wanted to steal my legacy. They wanted to dance on my grave. "You have 3 days," I whispered to the empty room. 3 days before I burn your entire world to the ground." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. I was alone in my private study on the second floor of the estate. The heavy mahogany doors were locked tight from the inside. The house was completely silent, but the storm inside my mind was raging with a violence I had never felt before. I walked over to my massive oak desk and turned on the small brass reading lamp. The warm yellow light spilled across the polished wood, illuminating the thick manila folder that David had given me at the diner. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. My chest felt incredibly heavy. For 30 years, I had lived with a gaping hole in my heart. I had spent every waking moment thinking about my missing son, wondering if he was safe, wondering if he was even alive. And now the answers were sitting right in front of me, waiting to be uncovered. I slowly sat down in my leather chair and pulled the folder toward me. My hands were remarkably steady now. The fake trembling I had put on for Maya and Trent earlier that afternoon was completely gone. I opened the cover and began to spread the documents across the surface of my desk. I expected to see old police reports or faded photographs or maybe witness testimonies from the day Jamal was taken. But as I looked closer, I realized these were not police files at all. They were financial records. There were dozens of thick stacks of offshore bank statements, corporate registry documents, and wire transfer logs. I saw letterheads from banks in the Cayman Islands and shell companies registered in Panama. My brow furrowed in deep confusion. Why would my son bring me international banking records to explain his kidnapping? I picked up the first stack of papers and adjusted my reading glasses. The name printed at the top of the main ledger jumped out at me immediately. Elite Finders. Seeing those two words felt like a physical blow to my chest. I knew that name intimately. Elite Finders was the premier private investigation firm that I had been funding for the last 15 years. I remembered the exact day they were hired. It was Trent who had brought them to my attention. He had come into my office looking so incredibly sincere, so deeply concerned for his grieving father-in-law. He told me he had found a shadow agency run by former intelligence operatives. He said they were the best in the world at tracking down missing persons, but they were incredibly expensive and required absolute discretion. Because I was a desperate, heartbroken father, I did not ask too many questions. I just wanted my son back. I wanted to find Jamal so badly that I blindly authorized the payments. Month after month, year after year, I signed off on massive wire transfers to Elite Finders. $100,000 here, $200,000 there. Whenever Trent told me they had a new lead on Jamal, I wrote the check without a second thought. Over 15 years, I poured exactly $5 million of my personal fortune into that investigation firm. I gave them a fortune, hoping they would bring me my boy. I flipped to the next page in the folder. It was the official corporate registration for Elite Finders unmasking the offshore shell company. I scanned down to the line that listed the primary beneficiary and sole owner of the agency. The name printed there in bold black ink was Trent. I stopped breathing. The air in my study turned into pure ice. I read the name again and again, making sure my 75-year-old eyes were not deceiving me. But the ink did not change. Trent was the sole owner. Elite Finders was not a team of highly trained intelligence operatives searching for my missing son. It was a fake company. It was a complete ghost. My own son-in-law had invented a fictional detective agency specifically to exploit my deepest pain. I turned the pages frantically, now my eyes tracing the flow of the money. David had done an immaculate job tracking every single cent. The $5 million I had wired over the last 15 years did not go to investigators or informants. The bank statements showed exactly where my money went. It went to high-stakes poker tables in Las Vegas. It went to luxury car dealerships. It went to cover Trent's massive gambling debts and to fund his pathetic failing business ventures that he kept hidden from the public eye. Every time Trent came to me with a sad look on his face, telling me that a promising lead on Jamal had unfortunately gone cold. He was just covering his tracks after losing my money at a casino. He sat at my dinner table. He drank my expensive wine. He looked me directly in the eye and offered me fake sympathy about my kidnapped son, all while siphoning millions of dollars directly from my grieving heart. And Maya, my own flesh and blood, either knew about it or chose to look the other way, so long as her lavish lifestyle remained untouched. They had monetized my tragedy. They had turned my endless nightmare into their personal piggy bank. A normal man might have broken down right then and there. A normal father might have buried his face in his hands and wept at the sheer monstrous cruelty of it all. But I am not a normal man, and at 75 years old, I do not cry. Tears are for the weak. Tears are for victims, and I was officially done being a victim. The sorrow that had defined the last 30 years of my life evaporated entirely into the cold, sterile air of my study. In its place, a dark, terrifying clarity took over. It was a cold, calculating anger that burned with the absolute precision of a laser. They thought I was just an old fool slipping into dementia. They thought I was a fragile old man who could easily be pushed aside. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you awaken a sleeping giant. I calmly stacked the papers back into a neat pile and placed them inside the folder. Then, I reached across my desk and picked up my private encrypted telephone. I did not call my local bank. I bypassed them entirely. I dialed the direct secure line to my wealth manager at my primary financial institution in Geneva, Switzerland. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered on the other end. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," the manager said. "How can I assist you at this hour?" I leaned back in my leather chair, staring into the shadows of my study. "I need to make some immediate adjustments to my accounts," I said, my voice sounding as smooth and cold as a frozen lake. "First, I want you to immediately freeze every secondary credit card tied to my personal wealth portfolio. Specifically, any black cards issued under the names of Maya and Trent. Decline all future transactions starting right this exact second. No warnings, no notifications. Just cut the lines." "Consider it done, sir," the manager replied without a single hint of hesitation. "Is there anything else?" "Yes," I said, my grip tightening around the telephone receiver. "I am initiating an immediate emergency lockdown on the corporate accounts for Washington Logistics. I am officially revoking Trent's executive access to the primary operating accounts and the company trust funds. Remove his signature authority completely. If he tries to wire money, if he tries to write a check, or if he attempts to access the corporate reserves, I want the system to flag it as unauthorized and deny the request." The manager typed rapidly on his keyboard. The sound of the keys clicking was the sweetest music I had heard in years. "Executive access revoked," he confirmed. "He is completely locked out of the financial infrastructure, sir. No one can move a single dollar without your direct authorization." "Thank you," I replied. "Keep your phone close. We will have much more work to do on Friday." I hung up the receiver and placed it gently back onto the cradle. The entire phone call had taken less than 3 minutes. In 3 short minutes, I had completely severed their lifelines. I had built the financial fortress they lived in, and with a single conversation, I had locked the gates from the outside. The financial guillotine was now officially raised high into the air. They had no idea what was coming. Tomorrow, Trent would try to pay for a luxurious lunch with his corporate card, and it would decline. Maya would try to buy another overpriced designer handbag to soothe her non-existent conscience, and the machine would flash red. They would assume it was a banking error. They would call the customer service lines complaining and screaming at operators who would have absolutely no answers for them. They would be blind and arrogant right up until the moment I dropped the blade on their necks. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the large window overlooking my vast estate. The manicured lawns, the towering oak trees, the long winding driveway. It all belonged to me. I had earned every single blade of grass. For years I had felt like a ghost haunting my own mansion, waiting for a son who was never coming home. But tonight, I felt more alive than I had in 3 decades. I looked up at the moon glowing brightly in the dark Atlanta sky. My boy was alive, and he had come back to me. He had brought me the sword I needed to cut the rot out of my family tree. I smiled a slow, dangerous smile into the reflection of the glass. 3 days. They had 3 days left to pretend they were royalty. Let them drink my expensive champagne. Let them plan their grand corporate takeover. The stage was set, and the audience was invited. I was going to give them the exact public spectacle they wanted, but it would be a show they would never ever forget. I reached into the very bottom of the thick manila folder. My fingers brushed against something small and cold, hiding in the corner. I pulled it out and held it under the warm light of my brass reading lamp. It was a simple silver flash drive. The metal felt incredibly heavy in the palm of my hand, like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. I plugged the drive into the side of my computer. A single folder popped up on the bright screen. It was labeled with just 2 words, "The Truth." I moved my mouse and opened the folder. There were 2 items inside, a typed document and an audio file. I opened the typed document first. My eyes scanned the black text on the white screen. What I read made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. It was the missing puzzle piece I had agonized over for 3 long decades. I had always wondered who took my boy. I assumed it was a random act of cruelty by a desperate stranger. But the truth was far more sinister and far closer to home. Trent did not kidnap Jamal. Trent was only 18 years old 30 years ago. He was just a teenager when my son was snatched from our front yard. But his uncle was not a teenager. His uncle was a ruthless man, deeply involved in an underground human trafficking ring operating in the shadows of the city. According to the documents and court records David had compiled, Trent's uncle had purchased my 5-year-old son from the original kidnappers. He changed Jamal's name to David. He hid my boy away in a different state, erasing his identity completely. Trent grew up knowing exactly where the stolen heir to the Washington logistics empire was living. He knew my son was breathing and walking on this earth while I spent millions of dollars and shed millions of tears trying to find him. Trent used that dark secret to his advantage. He positioned himself perfectly in my life. He met my daughter Maya at a corporate event. He charmed her. He married his way into my family and my massive fortune, all while knowing the true heir was alive and hidden away by his own flesh and blood. He sat at my Thanksgiving table year after year. He ate my food. He drank my expensive wine. He watched me light a candle for Jamal every single year on his birthday. He watched me grieve like a broken man, and he held that terrible secret in his pocket like a winning lottery ticket. The sheer magnitude of his deception was absolutely staggering. It was hard for my old mind to comprehend that level of pure evil. But as horrific as Trent's silence was, it was not the worst thing inside that folder. The worst thing was the audio file. I clicked on the digital audio file. The sound of a quiet room filled my computer speakers. There was the faint ambient noise of a private hotel suite, the soft clinking of a coffee cup, the rustling of fabric. Then I heard a voice. It was a younger, slightly more hesitant version of the man I had just met at the diner. It was David. He sounded incredibly nervous, but filled with a desperate, fragile hope. He explained how he had finally found his original birth records hidden away after Trent's uncle passed away. He explained how he had submitted his DNA to a registry and found a match to the Washington family. He said he remembered brief flashes of his early childhood. He remembered a big house with a long driveway. He remembered a loving father who used to carry him on his shoulders. He remembered his older sister Maya, who used to read him stories. He was speaking directly to someone in that room. He had reached out to his big sister. I leaned closer to the computer, holding my breath. I waited to hear Maya's voice. I wanted to hear her cry out in joy. I wanted to hear the sound of a sister embracing the little brother she thought she had lost forever. I wanted to hear her say that they needed to drive straight to my house so we could finally be a family again. But that is not what I heard. I heard Maya speak. Her voice was crystal clear and razor sharp. There was zero warmth in it. There was no joy. There was no love. There was only panic and cold calculation. I listened in absolute horror as my own daughter breathed heavily into the microphone. David was telling her he just wanted to come home. He just wanted to see his father again before it was too late. He did not care about the money. He just wanted his family. Instead of a hug, I heard the heavy thud of something large landing on a wooden table. It sounded exactly like a heavy leather briefcase. Then I heard the sharp metallic click of latches opening. Maya spoke again, and her voice echoed in my quiet study, slicing through my heart like a jagged piece of glass. She did not sound like a loving sister. She sounded like a ruthless corporate shark eliminating a business rival. She was completely terrified of splitting the billion-dollar inheritance. She knew that if Jamal returned home, he would immediately be recognized as the rightful heir. She knew her massive slice of the pie would be cut in half. She looked at her own flesh and blood, her baby brother, and she saw nothing but a massive financial threat. Her recorded voice filled the room loud and clear. "My father has a weak heart. If you show up now, the shock will kill him. Take the cash and disappear. You do not belong in this family anymore." I sat completely paralyzed in my leather chair. The audio file ended, leaving a heavy, dead silence in my office. "My father has a weak heart. If you show up now, the shock will kill him." She had weaponized my health. She had used my age and my grief as an excuse to banish her own brother forever. She had handed him a briefcase packed with $100,000 in cash to buy his silence. She had traded her brother's life and her father's happiness for a monopoly on my bank accounts. And the worst part was the date on the audio file. This happened 5 entire years ago. For 5 long years, she had watched me suffer. She had watched me waste away, sitting in diners, staring at faded photographs, knowing perfectly well my son was alive and actively trying to come home. She had looked me in the eye every single morning, carrying the weight of that monstrous betrayal with a smile on her face. My breathing slowly stabilized. The crushing sorrow that had weighed down my chest for 30 years evaporated completely into the thin air. The grief was entirely gone. It was violently replaced by something entirely different. My sorrow transformed into pure calculating wrath. I had spent my entire life trying to be a good and providing father. I had given Maya everything a child could ever dream of. I had given her a life of absolute untouchable luxury, and she had sold out her own blood for pure greed. She had looked at the brother she used to play with in the garden, and she had paid him to disappear like he was a piece of garbage. I felt a dark, terrifying calmness wash over my mind. There were no tears. There was no shaking. I was an old man, but I was also a man who had built a ruthless corporate empire. I knew exactly how to destroy enemies. I knew exactly how to dismantle competitors piece by piece until they had nothing left. I had just never applied those brutal skills to my own family, until tonight. Trent was a parasite who exploited my pain for casino money, but Maya was a traitor to her own blood. Her betrayal was an unforgivable sin against nature itself. The penalty for treason in my kingdom would be absolute total annihilation. I reached across my large oak desk and picked up my secure phone. I took the small business card David had given me at the diner. I stared at the numbers printed on the card. My son, my boy, was out there waiting for me in the dark city. He had been cruelly rejected by his sister, but he had not given up. He had spent 5 years gathering all this evidence. He had built an airtight, flawless case against the monsters living inside my house. He had come to me today because he knew I was strong enough to handle the ugly truth. He knew his father was a fighter. I dialed the number slowly. The phone rang only once before he answered. He did not say hello. He just waited on the other end of the line. He knew exactly who was calling. I held the phone tight against my ear. I could feel the powerful connection between us vibrating across the city. It was the unbreakable bond of father and son that no amount of money and no amount of evil could ever sever. I took a deep breath. My voice was no longer that of a grieving, broken old man. It was the voice of a king preparing to go to war. "I am so sorry I did not find you sooner, son," I said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy with 30 years of missing him. I heard him let out a slow, shaky breath on the other end of the line. It was the sound of a boy finally coming home after a very long journey in the dark. But we did not have time to cry. We had an empire to clean up. I stood up from my desk, looking out the window at the sprawling estate that I was about to reclaim from the traitors who slept in its halls. Now put on a tailored suit. I commanded, my voice echoing with pure icy vengeance. We are going hunting. The sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my home office, but the warmth did not touch me. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk, the same desk where I had built my empire, the same desk where I had wept for my missing son. Today it was a stage. I was about to deliver the greatest performance of my 75 years on this earth. I had spent the entire night finalizing the logistics with David and my Swiss bankers. The traps were set. The financial walls had closed in around my daughter and her husband. Now all I needed was to lure them into the center of the arena. I reached up and messed up my collar just a bit. I unbuttoned my cuffs, letting them hang loose. I practiced letting my hands shake a subtle tremor in my fingers that sold the image of a man whose mind and body were finally giving out. A man who was broken by the heavy weight of grief and age. I pressed the intercom button and told my assistant to send Maya and Trent into the office. I did not have to wait long. I heard their footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. They walked through the double doors without even knocking. Trent came in first, wearing a sharp navy blue suit, his chin held high with that arrogant swagger I had grown to absolutely despise. Maya followed right behind him, holding a designer cup of coffee, scrolling through her phone with an annoyed expression on her face. Neither of them bothered to ask how I had slept. Neither of them cared that they had threatened to lock me in an asylum just 24 hours ago. Trent stood in front of my desk and crossed his arms. He looked down at me like a vulture waiting for an old lion to stop breathing. Well, he said, his voice dripping with impatience. We do not have all morning. Have you made your decision? Are we doing this the easy way, or am I filing the medical guardianship papers with the court today? I forced my shoulders to slump forward. I let out a long, rattling sigh that sounded like it was coming from the very bottom of my tired lungs. I raised my hands and let my fingers shake violently as I rested them on the polished wood of my desk. I looked up at them with my eyes wide and pleading, playing the exact role of the fragile, confused old man they thought I was. I even looked down at a small silver frame on my desk that held a picture of Jamal, and I forced a single tear to pool in my eye. You win, I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. I am so tired, Trent. I am just so incredibly tired. Maya stopped scrolling on her phone. She looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied my face. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out if this was a trick. But my performance was flawless. The shaking hands, the defeated posture, the broken voice. It was exactly what she wanted to see, so she believed it completely. She had always underestimated my strength. What are you saying, Dad? She asked, stepping closer to the desk. I am saying that I cannot fight you anymore, I replied, dropping my gaze to my shaking hands. You are right, Maya. It has been 30 years. My little boy is gone. He is never coming back. I have spent my entire life chasing a ghost, and it has completely drained me. The search has taken everything out of me. I do not have the strength to keep the trust fund frozen. I do not have the strength to run the company anymore. You win. Both of you win. Trent let out a sharp breath of victory. His posture immediately relaxed, and a massive, greedy smile spread across his face. He looked at Maya with undisguised triumph, then looked back at me. Finally, he said, letting out a dark chuckle, I am glad you finally found some common sense in that fading brain of yours. It is about time you stepped aside and let the real business minds handle the future. So you will sign the declaration of death. You will release the $20 million back into the company accounts. Yes, I will sign it, I said quietly. I will sign the death certificate, and I will officially step down from Washington Logistics. I am ready to name you as the new Chief Executive Officer, Trent. The sheer naked greed that flashed across their faces was absolutely sickening. If I did not already know the horrible truth about them, I might have vomited right then and there. I watched my own daughter smile at the prospect of erasing her little brother from existence just so she could upgrade her lifestyle. But I kept my composure. I kept my hands shaking. There is only one condition, I added, making my voice sound desperate and small. Trent frowned, his guard going up instantly. What condition? I want to do it with dignity, I said, looking up at him with teary eyes. I do not want to just sign a piece of paper in a dark room and be pushed out the back door like an embarrassment. I built this empire with my own 2 bare hands. If I am going to say goodbye to my son and step down from my life, long work, I want to do it properly. This weekend is the company annual charity gala. I want to do it there. I want to sign the papers on the stage. I want to pass the torch to you publicly, Trent. I want the board of directors and the entire industry to see that I am making this choice willingly, so they will respect your new authority without any questions. I watched the trap snap shut right in front of my eyes. Trent was a man driven entirely by his massive, fragile ego. The idea of taking over my billion-dollar empire was good, but the idea of doing it on a stage in front of hundreds of wealthy elites was absolutely intoxicating to him. He could not resist the spectacle. He wanted an audience for his grand coronation. He wanted the whole city of Atlanta to watch him take the crown from the old king. Maya smiled, a bright, cold smile that chilled me to the bone. That is actually a wonderful idea, Dad, she said, her voice suddenly dripping with fake sugary sweetness now that she was getting exactly what she wanted. A public transition will be great for the company's stock price. The investors will love seeing a peaceful passing of the torch. It shows unity. And honestly, it will finally give this family the closure we so desperately need. Trent nodded vigorously, his eyes shining with absolute manic greed. Yes, we can definitely do that, he said, pacing back and forth across my office, already planning his grand moment in the spotlight. I will call the public relations team right now. We will invite the entire board of directors. We will invite all the major investors and shareholders. I will even have them send press passes to the local Atlanta media. I want cameras there. I want everyone to see that Washington Logistics has a new leader taking charge into the modern era. He was so drunk on imminent power that he could not see the massive hole he was digging for himself. They were completely blind. In fact, they were so incredibly blind that they did not even realize their entire financial world was currently collapsing right underneath their expensive designer shoes. Speaking of the company, Maya said, turning to Trent with a slight frustrated frown. Did you call the bank this morning about my black card? I tried to buy that diamond necklace online earlier and the transaction was completely declined. The website said the account was frozen. It was so humiliating. Trent waved his hand dismissively, not even slightly concerned by the warning sign. It is just a routine bank glitch. Maya, he said carelessly. The fraud department probably flagged a large purchase. I will have my assistant call them this afternoon and sort it out. Do not worry about it at all. By this weekend, we are going to have an extra $20 million in liquid cash anyway. You can buy the entire jewelry store if you really want to. A bank glitch. I almost laughed out loud. The sheer arrogance of these two monsters was astounding. They actually believed the entire world revolved around them. They had absolutely no idea that I had personally spoken to the Swiss wealth managers the night before. They had no idea that every single penny of their spending money was locked away behind a vault that they would never be able to open again. Trent thought he was going to have his assistant fix a simple error. He had no idea his assistant had already been locked out of the corporate system completely. Let us celebrate, Trent announced, walking over to the private wet bar in the corner of my office. He did not ask for permission. He reached right past my bourbon and grabbed a bottle of my most expensive vintage champagne. He popped the cork with a loud celebratory crack that echoed off the mahogany walls like a gunshot. He poured the bubbling golden liquid into 2 crystal flutes, handing one to his wife with a triumphant smirk. To the future, Trent declared, raising his glass high into the air. To a new era for Washington Logistics and finally leaving the dead in the past. To the future, Maya echoed, clinking her glass against his with a bright, joyful ring. They drank the expensive champagne, laughing and smiling, celebrating their massive victory. They were celebrating the death of my son and the end of my legacy. They stood right in front of me, drinking my wine inside my house, completely certain that they had outsmarted a foolish, broken old man. I sat behind my desk, my hands resting quietly on the polished wood. The shaking had completely stopped. I did not need to pretend anymore. They were not paying attention to me. I was already a ghost to them. I picked up my plain ceramic mug of black coffee and took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark, bitter liquid tasted absolutely perfect. I watched them toast to their own brilliant success. I looked at the way Trent puffed out his chest like he owned the entire universe. I looked at the way Maya admired her reflection in the windows, already dreaming of the billions she thought she was about to inherit. They were standing directly on a trap door, and they had just proudly tied the noose around their own necks. All I had to do was pull the lever. Enjoy the champagne, I thought to myself, keeping my face perfectly calm as the dark, calculating wrath continued to burn bright inside my chest. Drink up. Savor every single drop, because it is the absolute last free drink you will ever have. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in downtown Atlanta was dripping in crystal and gold. It was a sea of expensive tuxedos, designer evening gowns, and the blinding flash of cameras from the local media. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the city had gathered tonight. There were politicians, major shareholders, and board members who had known me since I was a young man, unloading delivery trucks with my own 2 hands. They were all sipping expensive champagne and whispering among themselves, fully believing they were about to witness the sad, quiet end of my legacy. I sat near the front of the stage, dressed in my finest tailored black suit. I kept my posture slightly stooped and my hands resting on my knees, letting them tremble just enough to maintain the illusion. I was playing the part of a broken, grieving old man whose mind was finally giving out. But inside my chest, my heart was beating with the steady, cold precision of a ticking time bomb. Trent stood up from our table and walked up the steps to the main stage. He looked like $1 million that did not belong to him. He stepped behind the polished wooden podium, adjusting the microphone with a look of deep, practiced sorrow on his face. The room slowly quieted down as he cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trent began, his voice echoing through the massive surround sound speakers. He sounded so incredibly sincere, so heavily burdened by the tragic duties of a loving son-in-law. "We are gathered here tonight to honor a titan of industry. My father-in-law has built Washington Logistics into a multi-billion-dollar empire. But as many of you know, he has carried an unbearable weight for 30 years. The tragic disappearance of his son, Jamal." Trent paused perfectly, bowing his head to let the fake emotion settle over the crowd. I watched him from my seat, feeling a dark, cold wrath burning in my veins. Age and grief take their toll on all of us. Trent continued, looking out at the wealthy investors who were nodding in sympathy. "And tonight, for the sake of his own health and the future of this great company, my father-in-law is finally choosing peace. He is officially closing the search. He is signing the declaration of death in absentia for Jamal. And he has graciously decided to pass the torch, officially naming me as the new chief executive officer of Washington Logistics." The room erupted into polite, respectful applause. Trent smiled, a smug, victorious grin that he could not quite hide. He gestured for me to join him on the stage. I stood up slowly. I let my legs look weak as I climbed the short stairs. The flashbulbs of the cameras went off like a lightning storm, capturing the tragic image of a defeated king surrendering his crown. I walked over to the podium. Trent placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, leaning in to whisper in my ear so the microphones would not pick it up. "Make it quick, old man," he muttered. "Sign the paper and get out of my way." He handed me the microphone and pointed directly to the thick, cream-colored legal document waiting on the lectern. The Declaration of Death. Next to it rested a solid gold fountain pen gleaming under the stage lights. I looked down at the paper. Then I looked at the pen. I let the silence stretch over the ballroom for 10 long seconds. The applause completely died down. The wealthy elites in the crowd leaned forward in their chairs, sensing that something was wrong. Maya, sitting in the front row, wearing a diamond necklace paid for by my sweat, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her eyes darted from me to Trent, a flicker of panic crossing her face. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I gripped the microphone tightly in my right hand. The shaking in my fingers completely vanished. I straightened my back, standing at my full height of 6 feet 2 inches. The fragile, broken old man disappeared instantly, replaced by the ruthless businessman who had conquered this city decades ago. Tonight, I said, my deep, gravelly voice booming through the ballroom with absolute authority. Tonight, I am signing over my entire empire. Every warehouse, every truck, every single dollar in my corporate accounts. I am handing over the keys to my kingdom. I paused, turning my head to look directly into Trent's suddenly terrified eyes, but not to Trent. Before Trent could even open his mouth to speak, I raised my left hand and signaled the private security detail stationed at the back of the room. The massive mahogany double doors at the entrance of the ballroom burst wide open. The sound was so loud it made people in the back rows jump in their seats. The soft classical music playing in the background was abruptly cut off. Down the center aisle, walking with a slow, powerful, and deliberate stride, came a man wearing a flawless, bespoke charcoal suit. It was David. But he was not just David anymore. He walked with his shoulders back and his chin held high. He walked with the exact same heavy, determined presence I had when I was 35 years old, building my empire from the ground up. The whispering in this crowd started immediately. It grew into a loud, frantic murmur. The older board members, the men and women who had known me since my youth, began to gasp and point. The resemblance was absolutely undeniable. He had my jawline. He had his mother's eyes. He was the living, breathing ghost of my past, walking straight toward the stage in front of the entire city. I raised the microphone to my lips. "Allow me to introduce Jamal Washington," I announced, my voice ringing with a fierce, unapologetic pride. "My son, my sole legal heir." The ballroom exploded into chaos. The journalists surged forward, pushing past the velvet ropes, their camera flashes blinding the room. Investors stood up from their tables, their mouths hanging open in pure shock. Trent turned completely ghost white. All the blood drained from his face. His smug, arrogant facade shattered into a million pieces. He lunged toward the microphone, waving his arms frantically at the security guards. "He is a fraud," Trent screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Security, get that man out of here right now. My father-in-law is losing his mind. The grief has finally broken his brain. He does not know what he is saying. This is a scam." I did not argue with him. I did not yell back. I simply reached into my suit pocket and pulled out a small black remote control. I looked at Trent with eyes as cold as the bottom of the ocean, and I pressed the first button. The massive projector screens behind us on the stage, which were supposed to display the new corporate logo for Trent's coronation, suddenly lit up with high-definition documents. "You want to talk about frauds?" "Trent," I asked, my voice cutting through the noise of the crowd like a sharp knife. On the massive screens appeared the official corporate registry for Elite Finders, the private investigation firm. Right next to it, blown up for the entire room to see, were the offshore bank statements. "For 15 years, my son-in-law exploited my broken heart," I declared to the horrified audience. "He created a fake detective agency and siphoned $5 million of my personal fortune directly into his private casino accounts to pay off his gambling debts." The crowd gasped in unison. The board members stared at the screens in absolute disgust. Trent stumbled backward, raising his hands as if he could physically block the images from being seen. He was shaking his head, trying to form words, but nothing came out. Then I pressed the button again. The screen shifted, and the certified 99.9% DNA match flashed in bold red letters for the entire media to capture. The proof was absolute. The son I had mourned for 30 years was standing right in front of them. Maya could not take it anymore. The reality of losing her billion-dollar inheritance completely broke her. She hiked up her expensive silk dress and rushed up the stairs of the stage. Her face was twisted in absolute fury, her perfect makeup ruined by the sudden violent destruction of her entire life. "You are crazy," Maya screamed at me, stepping in front of the projector screens. "You are a senile old fool. I am your daughter. You cannot do this to us. You cannot just give everything to a stranger." I looked at her. The little girl I had loved, the daughter I had given the world to. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I only felt the cold, hard demand for justice. "I am not doing this to you, Maya," I said softly into the microphone, letting the words echo through the silent, captivated ballroom. "You did this to yourself." I pressed the final button on the remote control. The screens went black and an audio recording began to play. It blasted through the surround sound speakers, crisp, loud, and horrifyingly clear. It was Maya's own voice. The recording from 5 years ago when her brother had finally found her and begged to come home. "My father has a weak heart." Maya's recorded voice echoed through the grand ballroom, dripping with cold, calculated cruelty. "If you show up now, the shock will kill him. Take the cash and disappear. You do not belong in this family anymore." The silence that followed the recording was heavier than a tombstone. It was a collective, suffocating silence of pure revulsion. The major investors, the politicians, the people Maya and Trent had spent their entire lives trying to impress, stared at them with absolute disgust. Then the reaction came. The major shareholders physically turned their backs toward the stage. The journalists shouted questions, their cameras flashing relentlessly, capturing every single second of Maya's spectacular downfall. Maya dropped to her knees right there on the stage. She hid her face in her trembling hands, sobbing hysterically as her reputation, her fortune, and her entire privileged life burned to absolute ash in front of the whole city. Trent was frozen against the podium, staring out at the angry crowd, realizing that he was not just losing a company. He was going to prison. I stood tall at the center of the stage, watching the empire I built finally cleanse itself of the poison that had infected it for years. The gala of ruin was complete, and the payout was everything I had ever dreamed of. Trent was not a smart man when cornered. As the audio of his wife's betrayal echoed through the grand ballroom, completely drowning out the shocked gasps of the Atlanta elite. His basic survival instinct finally kicked in. He thought he could just quietly walk away. He slowly backed away from the podium, his terrified eyes darting toward the heavy velvet curtains that masked the rear exit of the stage. He took one step backward, then another, desperately trying to slip into the shadows while the media cameras were focused entirely on Maya. But David and I had spent the last 3 days preparing for every single move they could possibly make. We did not just freeze their bank accounts. We built an inescapable cage. As Trent reached the edge of the stage, the heavy velvet curtains were violently shoved aside. 3 men wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their chests stepped directly into his path. Trent froze, his expensive leather shoes skidding on the polished wooden floor. The lead federal agent did not whisper. He did not ask politely. He grabbed Trent by the shoulder of his custom-tailored suit, spun him around roughly, and slammed him face first against the cold wooden podium. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the silent room. It was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 30 years. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, extortion, and corporate embezzlement," the agent announced, his voice carrying perfectly over the open stage microphones. Trent struggled weakly, his face pressed hard against the wood, his arrogant pride completely shattered into pieces. He looked out at the massive sea of investors, board members, and journalists. The very people he had invited to witness his glorious coronation were now recording his spectacular public downfall on their cell phones. He was ruined. His reputation was dead. He was going to spend the rest of his pathetic life in a federal prison cell, all because my son had handed the authorities an airtight dossier proving every single stolen dime. With Trent neutralized and dragged off the stage in absolute disgrace, the crushing reality of the situation finally crashed down on Maya. The illusion of her untouchable wealth shattered. She was no longer the pampered heiress of a billionaire. She was an accomplice to a monster, and she was completely out of options. She crawled across the stage floor on her hands and knees, Her expensive silk designer dress dragged against the polished wood. Her perfect hair was a tangled mess. Her makeup ran down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She reached out and grabbed my pant leg with both hands, gripping the fabric like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. "Dad, please," she sobbed hysterically, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "Dad, you cannot do this to me. I am your daughter. I am your little girl. I made a mistake. I was scared. Trent manipulated me. Please, Dad, please forgive me." I looked down at her. I looked at the woman who had shared my dinner table, who had watched me cry over her missing brother, who had secretly paid that same brother to disappear just so she could keep her lavish lifestyle intact. A normal father might have felt a twinge of pity. A normal father might have bent down to comfort his crying child. But the father inside me had died the moment I heard that audio recording in my private study. I felt absolutely zero emotion. There was no anger left. There was no sadness. There was only a vast, empty coldness. I reached down and firmly peeled her shaking fingers off my pant leg, stepping back so she could not touch me again. "You are not my daughter," I said, my voice low, steady, and loud enough for the front row of investors to hear every single word. "My daughter died 5 years ago when she looked her own kidnapped baby brother in the eye and handed him a briefcase full of cash to walk away." Maya let out a gut-wrenching wail, covering her face with her hands, but I did not stop. I wanted her to understand the absolute totality of her destruction. "Your corporate accounts are completely frozen." I continued my words, hitting her like physical blows. "Your personal credit cards are dead plastic. The locks on your mansion in Buckhead were changed at exactly 8 o'clock tonight. Your luxury cars are being repossessed as we speak. You have absolutely nothing left." She looked up at me, her chest heaving as she gasped for air, unable to comprehend that her entire universe had been erased in less than 10 minutes. "What am I supposed to do?" She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "Where am I supposed to go?" I looked down at her with a calm, icy expression. "Tomorrow morning, you can wake up and start looking for a minimum wage job like everyone else in the real world," I told her. "Let us see exactly how far that $100,000 you used to bribe your brother really goes when you have to actually pay for your own survival." I did not wait for her to answer. I did not want to hear another pathetic excuse or another fake apology. I simply turned my back on her and stepped off the stage, leaving Maya wailing on the floor like a broken child. The crowd of wealthy elites parted like the Red Sea as I walked down the center aisle. No one dared to speak. No one dared to look me in the eye. They had just witnessed a masterclass in absolute destruction, and they knew better than to stand in my way. I walked straight toward the back of the ballroom where David was waiting for me. He stood tall and proud in his bespoke charcoal suit. He did not look at his sister crying on the stage. He did not look at the police leading Trent out the side door. He only looked at me. I stopped in front of him. For a moment we just stood there, father and son, two men who had been robbed of 30 years of memories, birthdays, and quiet Sunday mornings. We did not say a single word to each other. We did not need to. The bond between us was instantly forged in the fire of justice and truth. There was an unspoken understanding that the painful past was finally dead, and the future was entirely ours to build. I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder. He nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking through his serious expression. Together, we turned around and walked out of the ballroom, pushing through the heavy mahogany double doors and leaving the garbage behind us. When we stepped out into the cool Atlanta night air, I took a deep, cleansing breath. The heavy, suffocating weight of grief that had crushed my chest for 3 decades was completely gone. The constant, gnawing pain of not knowing what happened to my boy had simply vanished into the wind. I looked up at the clear night sky, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of peace. At 75 years old, society tells you that your life is wrapping up. They tell you to sit in a rocking chair, reflect on your past, and wait for the end. But they are entirely wrong. I am no longer a grieving father chasing a ghost through the shadows. I am no longer a man running on sorrow and false hopes. I am a man who finally got his son back. And as I walked down the street with my boy by my side, I knew one absolute truth. My life is just beginning. How would you respond if your own family betrayed you for money? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. If there is one thing this entire nightmare has taught me, it is that blood does not automatically make someone family. Family is built on loyalty, respect, and unconditional love, not greed and entitlement. We spend our lives working hard to provide for the people we care about, but sometimes our endless generosity only turns them into monsters. Money has a funny way of stripping away fake masks and revealing exactly who people truly are deep down inside. Never be afraid to cut out the toxic roots of your own family tree to save the rest of the garden, because you owe your peace of mind to no one but yourself. If this story gave you strength, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs the courage to take their life back.